because we're aging. I'm leaving my job. I need someone to fill my job. I'm not leaving the state. I'm a super fan of Colorado, and I won't be going anywhere. But we'll need somebody to fill my job, and we're growing more jobs. So that's why we have migration, expected migration, above job growth. When we migrate people to Colorado, what kind of folks do we get? We get youngins. We attract, our bread and butter migrant is a youngin, 22 to 37. Kind of peaks up here right there at the kind of 22, 23, and then slows down. There's a yellow line there right at 65, just to indicate that we don't get a lot of movement around there, but it's slightly positive over the age of 65 in terms of that. But it's important to know that every county is very different in terms of its attraction, but this is Colorado as a whole. So let's talk about age and why it matters so much. But I want you to really focus on the fact that we attract youngins. And we have attracted youngins forever. Our first big group of youngins that migrated to the state were the boomers. In the 70s, we started attracting a lot of people. You saw we had 5% annual average growth rate. A lot of that were the youngins, boomers, that migrated here in the 70s. So why do we even care about age? Why do we look at it? And it's my most favorite variable that we ever talk about in our office. One, because everything changes by age. Your preferences, thank God, right? I've got an 18 and a 21-year-old, and I am hoping they change their preferences. Right? Thank goodness. What you buy, where you shop, how you interact, the types of jobs you have, how much money you earn, the type of house you want, whether you're an owner or renter, all changes by age, as well as your level of service demands. Whether you're a kiddo and need K-8, or maybe an older adult that needs maybe transportation services, or anything in between. So because of our migration pattern, and the way that we migrate people to Colorado, this is our age distribution. Kind of takes a look at what Bob was showing earlier in terms of those population pyramids. I just like to put them all together in one direction. So what we've got here is the black line is at 65. Again, not because anything's magic at 65. I just wanted it there for reference. We've got our blue silent generation. I did them. I put them in here because they still exist right now, right? 2019, we've still got our silent generation, followed by our boomers. Then we've got our green Gen X, our red millennials, our blue post-millennials, and then our brown next generation. Can you believe we've got 2 more generations past millennials? And all we talk about are millennials? I'm like, what about the post-millennials? But what do you see? Do you see this slope? When I said there was a slowdown in births, there's a slowdown in births. And the most interesting thing about a person is you cannot create a new 20-year-old without having it 20 years previously. If you decided that you don't have enough of a certain age, you can't go get a new one. Not like a car or a building or a house or anything like that you can create that supply. Once they don't exist, they don't exist unless you migrate them in potentially from out of country. You'll see that we've got this peak here for our millennials. They're right now at 2930. It's when the peak millennial was born in 1990, 1991. So right now they're 2930. You can see them there, and you can see the other age groups. So if we look at aging over time, and this is really important to understanding public finance and some of the choices we made when we were younger, 1990, this is our age distribution, this darker colored orange. And you can see the baby boomers in that big bulge right there in the middle, 22 or 25 to 44, or in that time period right there. That's where the big bulge was. Then, between 1990 and 2010 is the darker colored orange. You can see, or the lighter color orange behind it, and you can see that where people aged into that time frame. So we saw a lot of growth in the 45 to 64-year-olds between 1990 and 2010. A little bit of growth in the youngins, very little growth in the 30-year-olds. Tell me something about the 45 to 64-year-olds, because that's what we grew really fast between 1990 and 2010. Highest earning, highest spending, highest property tax paying. This was nirvana. We had the fastest growing segment of our population in the highest earning, highest spending, highest property tax paying. And we thought it was going to last forever. And then what happened? 2010. Everything slows down in growth in that age group. In 1930, if you made it to 65 already, you were already forecast to make it to 77. So we haven't seen as many improvements at the older end, because it's like, once you make it through life, you've got a really good chance of making it a little bit longer. What's really hard, what's the hardest age groups? Who pays the highest insurance?
Young people.
Those young adults. Those 16 and 17-year-olds, they're troublemakers. One of the biggest improvements in longevity was what? Can we remember? What increased longevity the most? Antibiotics was huge, but what was even more significant? Seatbelts and helmets.
No.
Yes.
No.
Those.
But helmets have a very serious unintended expensive consequence.
But and I'm not going to argue with you on the expense, but I'm just saying in terms of longevity, they may not be good, but they're still alive. And that's all I'm looking at is the data. Point, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to crass like that. Point being is that that's where we've made the largest improvements is actually at the youngest ages. And so we'll see what happens out into the future in terms of longevity, but that's where we've seen the biggest increases. And unfortunately, I think once we get the 2020 data, we're going to see very, very flat information around the age 45 to 55, because we actually saw declines in longevity the last several years, because there's a lot of our middle-aged adults that they call it death of despair. So drug use, other things, suicide is putting this downward pressure, but primarily at that middle-aged time frame. So why do we care about aging, and especially aging in the 65 plus? When we look at the different aging matters, one, Colorado is the 6th youngest state in terms of its share of the population over the age of 65. But we are the 3rd fastest aging. And why? Because we end up with a lot of folks under the age of 65 aging into that 65 plus, just because of the way you saw our migration. We're forecasting that increase in the 65 plus to increase from about 600,000 to 700,000 to 1.2 million just between 2015 and 2030. So just in that 15-year time frame, increasing by over 500,000 people. Huge economic driver. Huge impact on jobs within the state in terms of looking at our occupational mix and the spending of people over the age of 65 really doing a lot to help generate job growth. Important impact in terms of our labor force. Huge part of our labor force, but also aging out of our labor force really rapidly. About 1 million forecast in our labor force right now, aging out within the next 15 years. Housing, huge impact, primarily homeowners. We're looking at why we've seen a lot of slowdown in movement in housing units. A lot of them have to do with the fact that we've got older adults that are just homeowners and they don't move a lot. You tend to move when you're younger, not as much as when you're older. Downward pressure on income, because a lot more people are in age groups that are not actively earning income. They are primarily retired. Impact on health and disabilities, transportation, public finance across the board. So let's talk about aging in terms of an economic driver. People over the age of 65 spend dollars, and their spending creates about a third of a job per person. And where are we spending our dollars when we're older? Health services. What else? Services as a whole. Eating out is a big one as well. So health services alone is estimated to support about a tenth of a job per person over the age of 65. Right now, we're forecasting that seniors or population over the age of 65 supports about 242,000 jobs in the state in 2014, forecast to increase to about 410,000 jobs out into the future. But that's huge impact on our occupational mix, because they're both high service and low service jobs, high income and low income jobs. If we look at the jobs that we've created since 2008, since the Great Recession, health services by far are the largest growth in jobs. And so we've got this color-coded by different things. The purple is a mid-wage job, green is a high-wage job, red is a low-wage job. And so what we've seen this growth in our top 5 here: health services, professional and technical services, accommodations, food service, transportation, and state government. We knew that this was going to be the case in the state. We knew that health services and accommodations, food service were going to be the top growers because of why? Because our fastest growing age group is the 65 plus. All you have to look at is consumer expenditures by age. Do the math, and that's the fastest growing industries, and that is what we've seen. We've also seen within the state, though, that most of our fastest growing industries have been in lower wages and then followed by mid-wages, or actually mid-wages first and then low-wage jobs. So we've seen a growth 43% in mid-wage jobs, 36% in low-wage jobs, and 21% in high-wage jobs. My question is that the same proportion we've been building in terms of housing units? Or maybe not. And why not? So if we look at senior-supported jobs, healthcare and social assistance is number 1, retail trade number 2, other services number 3, accommodations, food service number 4, construction number 5. So you can kind of get an idea of where those jobs are created by spending. So let's talk about tightening in the labor force just a little bit before we finish up. One of the reasons we're feeling the labor force so tight right now is due to aging, because there's so many more people leaving the labor force now than ever before. Just 2 decades ago, on average, is about 35,000 people aging out of the labor force annually. We're up to 60,000 a year now, even with extended labor force participation rates. Even assuming that people are working longer, we're still seeing much faster, almost a doubling of the number of leavers from the labor force. Baby boomers are about 37% of our total labor force, approximately 1 million people aging out over the next 20 years. Huge increase in demand. Again, I'm going to be retiring, somebody needs to take my job, but I'm also going to stay here and spend my money, and I'm going to create a job that way as well. So I am both generating and creating more jobs just by being here. Labor force participation rates are falling at the youngest ages, and that's a problem within the state. But we're seeing an extension of labor force at the older end. Certainly demands will vary by industry. The oldest aged industries right now, so the industries with the oldest workers are education, health, utilities, mining, and government. So looking at how do we make sure that we fill those jobs. And then certainly an increase in demand for caregivers. So those that leave the labor force to take care of an aging parent or aging relative or whoever it might be. So one of the biggest things that we need to be looking at is how do we extend labor force participation and get more people in the labor force for a longer period of time. If we don't want more migrants, not that I don't, I love them, but if we want to minimize it, we need to make sure that people stay and age in the labor force longer. And that means even at the youngest ends. If we look at labor force participation over time, we can see it, especially the 65 plus, we can see it increasing for both men and women, and much higher than the US as a whole, which is great. But we're feeling this tightening because we're going to see more leaving than entering. And so that's where we're feeling the squeeze right now, is with the number of leavers versus the number of entrants. It's also going to impact our labor force in terms of complete participation size. Looking at 1990, about 55% of our labor force was 11% of our 55 plus was in the labor force in 1990. Forecast to increase to about 23% by 2030, and you can see those different shares. So much more diverse labor force than ever. Really important to be looking at aging in terms of education and labor force. We know that life expectancy increases most for those with higher levels of educational attainment. Higher levels of educational attainment lead to a higher proportion of white-collar and professional jobs at higher incomes, and then higher educational levels also lead to higher labor force participation. So education across the board is important to increasing both income and labor force participation. I'm not going to hit that. In terms of home ownership and the home market, because you guys are going to be talking about that a lot today, this looks at both movers and ownership by age in Colorado. So if we look across the board percentage-wise, owners are about 64% of all homeowners or households, with 36% are renters. And the average of non-movers are 82%. What do we mean by a non-mover? That is somebody that's not actively moved that last year. So 82% of us don't move, 18% of us move on an annual basis, if you take it at average over time. But if you look by age, our highest levels of home ownership are the 65 to 74-year-olds in the state. In terms of by age group, highest share. And who's our fastest growing age group? 65 plus. The next group is in this 55 to 64 and then the 75 plus, all in the highest share of home owners. And this is our fastest growing age group. When we look at movers, we can also see that our older households move the least. So there's less houses coming onto the market, less movement on those coming in and out. And I love picking on my mom. She's 83. She's in the same house that I grew up in. 5-bedroom home, 3,500 square feet, living alone. Now, I'm an economist, so I can say this to her. I call her a wasted housing resource. And she does not take kindly to that. And I totally get it. She should be allowed to be wherever she wants to be. But thinking about resource use, we built a lot of housing that are large lots, lots of rooms. And here she is living alone in a 5-bedroom home when she really could have 4 other people with her. There's a lot of my mom out there. She is not the only one that's potentially wasting a housing resource. And I don't mean it in a negative sense, I'm just saying allocation of housing to population. And so it's important to see that balance within the state as well. We know that there's different incomes are impacted by age. This just shows income by age, and so our peak earning is 45 to 54, and that shows the different share you're earning by type. I'm bringing this up because it'll be part of your discussions in the afternoon. We also know that in terms of taxing, that it's the same piece, that our taxable income and tax collections rise and fall based on age. And you can see the different spending areas of where pieces are taxed. But again, those 45 to 54-year-olds kind of being the bread and butter. So what are some of the summary points that we should be thinking about now, taking all of the aging and public finance into account? Our ratio of earners to non-earners is changing. And it's becoming much more narrow, that there's many few earners to non-earners than we've had in the past. But we're not unusual. We're actually becoming more like the national average. We're still better than the national average, but becoming more like the national average. We know that there are reduced revenues due to aging based on income tax, sales tax, and property tax, with the fastest growing age group in areas with the lowest taxable income, lowest spending on goods, and typically lowest property tax paying area. On the public finance needs side, we see an increase in health services, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, all increasing on the public service side. So we can see this impact from the two different components. So what are we forecasting for the future for Colorado in terms of total numbers? One, increasing from that 5.7 million to about 8.1 million by 2050. Now I know I said things are slowing, and if you did your math quickly on a Monday morning, which I'm still a little groggy, 2.4 million people. How does that seem slower? That is slow. Slower than our forecast. Even in 2006, our forecast was in the state was 9.1 by 2050. We've decreased our forecast by 1 million. Why? The Great Recession and birth rates really brought down our forecast. But you'll see here, where are we forecasting most of the growth? In the Front Range. How many of you live in the Front Range? All I can say is more friends, right? A lot more friends. If we take that 2.4 million, where are we forecasting them? 2 million along the Front Range. 1 million in the Denver metro area. 600,000 up north between Larimer and Weld, 400 down south between Pueblo and El Paso, with the remaining 400,000 around the rest of the state. You may be wondering to yourself, what does that grayed out mean? Those are counties we're forecasting declines or flat. It's a lot of Colorado that's forecasting declines or flats. Again, that question is, how do we continue to balance this within the state? So, just to summarize the points, we are growing and slowing. We're slowing primarily because we're aging and we're seeing the slowing in the birth rates. We've got the downward pressure on the youngest end, fastest pressure on the older end. A lot of issues created in terms of this, but a lot of it is just our historical migration patterns. We saw a lot of growth in the 70s, driven by the baby boomers in that time frame. We don't have a lot of older people right now. And so that's the big transition in Colorado, is that we're finally seeing this growth in the 65 plus. Aging fast, but still younger than the US average. Lots of changes expected, especially in the Front Range and the Western Slope. And this has implications across all areas. Implications in terms of the economy, labor force, housing, transportation, public finance, healthcare. But the point is, we need to look at strategies that will address issues across all age spectrum. Because again, the best way to create a super successful 65 plus is making sure our 20-year-olds are all right. And making sure that they've got that ability to become a successful 65-year-old. And that means education, jobs, housing across the spectrum. So with that, I'm just going to leave that up there. Don't forget about Census 2020. The only way we can have really good data is by having a really successful 2020 count. Just remember to yourself, it's important, it's easy, it's safe. It's April 1st of 2020, and it's going to be really important that we get everyone counted, including all of you guys. So make sure that that is a priority that you guys think about. With that, thank you. I'm just going to leave that there so you really think about it a lot. All I've got it there. So no? No? All right. So thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.